talk will be the second in a mini-series about the past, present, and future of Yaquina Bay. This series was inspired by the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development's new effort to coordinate the revision of the Yaquina Bay Estuary Management Plan. The current management plans for all of Oregon's estuaries were created in the 80s to meet statewide planning goal 16. At that time, not only were the uses of Yaquina Bay different than they are today, but so were aspects of its physical and ecological structure. In light of this management plan revision, Mike Graybill, Walt Nelson, Bob Cowan, and I have invited a few speakers to give us an update on the current status of Yaquina Bay. Our second speaker in this series is Dr. Laura Brophy. Laura directs the Estuary Technical Group at the Institute for Applied Ecology, a nonprofit organization in Corvallis, Oregon. Most of her career is focused on developing and delivering science to support estuary and wetland restoration, conservation, and management for the benefit of coastal communities. Over the past 20 years, she's led field studies in nearly all of Oregon's major estuaries, including effectiveness monitoring at Oregon's largest tidal wetland restoration projects. From this work, she and her colleagues have made important discoveries about how our estuaries and tidal wetlands work. This has led to improved mapping of estuarine habitats and better data on valued estuarine functions like carbon sequestration and production of fish habitat. Currently, Laura is collaborating with regional and national teams to apply this new knowledge to help improve estuary management across the US. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you very much, Ted. It's great to see all your names here. So many familiar names, and I'm going to begin my slideshow. So yes, I'm really pleased to present to you on the past, present, and future of tidal wetlands in the Yaquina Bay Estuary in support of the management plan revisions. It's an exciting process. And in addition to directing the Estuary Technical Group at the Institute for Applied Ecology, which is a small nonprofit in Corvallis, as Ted mentioned, I'm also on the Marine Resource Management Program faculty at Oregon State, part of the College of Earth, Oceanic, and Atmospheric Sciences. So I'll be talking about information from a bunch of different projects, and they had many different funders and many different collaborators, but these are some of the organizations that have been most involved, and I want to thank all of them. Super supportive groups with a bunch of dedicated people, and one of those dedicated people was David Pitkin, who took this beautiful photo that you've probably seen before because it's one of the best photos of Tidal Marsh that I know of, and this is Pool Slough, and Dave took this picture in 2002, and I want to express appreciation for the amazing work he did, and I wish he was still with us. So this is sort of a roadmap of where I'm going to go today in my talk. I want to explain something about how dynamic the Yaquina Estuary is and some of what humans have, some of the effects that humans have had on the estuary, especially over the last 100 years, which have made it even more dynamic. And these activities of humans have altered the conditions of tidal wetlands in the estuary, of course, and affected the functions that we care about. And human-caused climate change and sea level rise are going to further alter these conditions and functions in big ways over the next 100 years. These changes will affect estuary-dependent species, including people. So I want to talk about some actions that we can take in order to help mitigate the impacts of these activities that we have undertaken and changes that we've caused. My focus for my talk is on emergent, shrub, and forested tidal wetlands. These two different types of emergent tidal wetlands, otherwise known as tidal marsh, are on the left, the low marsh and the high marsh. These are the most familiar of our tidal wetland ecosystems in the Northwest. But we also once had large areas of what we call tidal swamp, which were shrub or tree dominated, so woody dominated tidal wetlands. Forested tidal wetlands or tidal forests is another way you'll hear them referred to. And then besides the ones that I'm showing in this slide, other habitat types are definitely of interest, like eelgrass. And I know that Jim Caldy gave a cool seminar on that topic back in October, and the Midcoast had him speaking recently about eelgrass too. So I hope you all were able to attend those talks. So how about estuary dynamics? I want to talk about different time scales a little bit. On the geologic time scale, across hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of years, we have tectonics, of course. So the movement of the plates on the Earth's surface, which creates things like earthquakes, tsunamis, and land subsidence. And on the centennial scale, 100 years or a couple hundred years, we have those human impacts. After Europeans arrived in the area, major changes to the estuary and also the resulting climate change. And then on the annual scale, we see seasonal rainfall and storms in the winter and dry, warm weather in the summer. On the monthly scale, we see the spring and neap tide cycles, and on the daily scale, we see semi-diurnal tides. And I'm bringing up all these different time scales just to help illustrate the complexity of the estuary and how dynamic it is from moment to moment and from year to year and from century to century. So here is a picture of the Cascadia Megathrust fault, which I'm sure you've all heard of, off the shore of Oregon and Washington. And when this fault slips, as the plates move, we get big earthquakes. We haven't had one recently, but we're all concerned about it coming up again soon. This is an image of some land subsidence up in Alaska after the 1964 earthquake they had there. So those are dead spruce trees. It was a spruce forest. After the earthquake or during the earthquake, the land subsided. And I don't know how many feet or meters it subsided, but it was enough to bring this forest down to tidal marsh level. And the trees all died, and it's now a tidal marsh. So we could see those kinds of changes on our coast too. We don't yet know where they'll be most severe, but we can think of this as a kind of very rapid sea level rise. Now, in terms of human impacts, over the last couple of hundred years, we've of course had urban development. This is the city of Newport and the Yaquina Bay Bridge and the marina and Hatfield Marine Science Center and all the development at the mouth of the estuary, jetties, dredging and fill activity. Upstream, we have agricultural activities like this is the Boone Slough, Newt Slough complex. And this is an area maintained by dikes, the North Bay Road specifically, or the Yaquina Bay Road crossing where the tidal channels used to connect. It's an old meander of the river, but it's altered by stopping tidal flows from coming in. There are tide gates, by the way, below the roads, as you probably know. And then further upstream in Toledo, of course, we have a bunch of more developments, some industrial sites and so forth. And it's had its impacts as well. So a wide variety of human activities in the estuary that have had large impacts. Now, one of the biggest human impacts to the estuary potentially in the future is potentially sea level rise. And we haven't seen a lot of it yet, but there has been some sea level rise, and models and measurements really strongly suggest that we're going to be seeing a lot more. I'm sure you're all aware of these kinds of graphs that show the rapid rise in sea level and also the very great potential uncertainty in what future sea level rise may look like by 2100. That's quite a range from 2 meters to 7 meters of sea level rise potentially. 14 meters of sea level. That's millimeters. Well, anyway, there's a huge range. And on the annual timescale, as I was mentioning, we have seasonal rainfall and storms, and those create the winter conditions of high river levels that we really notice when we see flood events and the dynamics of storms and wave action and erosion and so forth. And thanks to Roy for this beautiful photo of a storm system blowing in. And by the way, that last illustration is 1.4 meters of sea level rise being the upper end of the projection. But I have to say these things are changing rapidly, and that is now considered a medium high scenario, not a high end scenario. This image is from 2012. So how about what those winter storms look like? King tides are good examples of how winter storm surges from the coast or simply high rainfall events combined with high tides can produce these very high tides called king tides. This picture is from Toledo, and you can see that even under current conditions, and this was 2015, the high tides associated with these high river and high rainfall events and high incoming tides get water levels up very close to our industrial facilities, and that's a big concern for the future. These may become hazards in the future. And our seasonal rainfall really combines with our very steep coastal geomorphology to produce big pulses of water and sediment, which move downstream to the estuary. So our landforms have a lot to do with this. And this is a good visual from the King Tides project and Lighthawk, showing how much sediment can be carried downstream during a king tide. This happens to be from the Coquille River estuary. A lot of sediment moves in these situations. Now, on the daily and monthly time scale, you see these neap and spring tide cycles. So here we have spring tides occurring and then neap tides with less extreme highs and lows. And then on the daily basis, the high and low semi-diurnal tides. So I'm bringing these all up again because we have very complex patterns of water levels and also resulting complex patterns of salinity. And I want to just demonstrate that with a couple locations. These happen to be outside the Yaquina. In 2014, we installed a salinity data logger in a natural tidal marsh channel at the south end of Tillamook Bay. Here we call it the Bay Marsh site. And this 4-part graph shows salinity at the top, 0 to 30 PSU, and this is in a tidal channel. This is in a least disturbed marsh, so it's a real natural system. Then you can see water level here. You don't see the low tides because this logger was out of water at low tide based on where we had to install it. Here's rainfall. You can see we're edging into the fall rains here at this time scale, by the way, is the month of October, essentially. So the rains started in mid-October, and then river flows responding to those rains and rising. And these data loggers recorded salinity and and water level at a 15-minute interval. And so what I'm trying to illustrate here is that there are several dynamics in play, even across a short period of time. On a daily basis, salinity ran from about 10 up to about 25 on each tide cycle on a daily basis at this location. There's a lot of freshwater flow coming down here. And then we saw salinity drop as the fall rains began. And after fall rains were well in place, we saw salinities that were pretty fresh at low tide and then still bumping up into the mesohaline at high tide. So there's a lot of fluctuation on a daily basis as well as across the seasons in Oregon and in the Yaquina. So just imagine that someone told you that in order to minimize methane production in a tidal wetland, in order to maximize your climate change mitigation functions and carbon sequestration, you need to have salinity below 18 or 19. You can look at a graph like this and say, but when and where? So these are good questions. And this is in-channel salinity, and it is very dynamic, which is why we've started looking at groundwater salinity a little more. And I won't have a lot of time to go into this, but I just wanted to quickly show you this example from Young's Bay. And this is a pretty low salinity wetland. Actually, it's a low marsh, high marsh, and shrub tidal wetland located kind of in the low salinity portion of the estuary with quite a bit of freshwater flow. Channel salinity is variable, both on a daily basis and then seasonally. This graph runs from 2 months from late September to late November. And salinities here only run from 0 to 11. But the main point I'm trying to illustrate is that groundwater salinity, which is in green here from the low marsh, and then in blue and purple from the high marsh and shrub tidal swamp, groundwater salinity is a lot more stable than channel salinity. It doesn't have the daily fluctuations. And it responds really differently to the time series of dry summer weather into rainy winter weather. You can see that groundwater salinity remained quite high through the fall, and in fact continued to remain high into March, which I don't have that slide up here, but suffice it to say, we think that looking at groundwater salinity is going to tell us a lot about what's happening in the soil, which in turn, of course, is the primary area where methane would be produced. So moving beyond dynamics into human impacts, how have humans influenced the estuary? So I've already mentioned a couple of locations in the estuary, and you're familiar, I'm sure, with this map. Toledo, the Boone Slough, Newt Slough complex here, and Newport. This is what our tidal wetlands looked like 200 years ago, and this is from work that was funded and coordinated by PMEP that I finished up in 2019. In this map, these are all areas, all the colored areas you see are within current tide range, and that was similar to tide range a couple hundred years ago, not too different. And the yellowish, orangish areas are areas that were historically tidal marsh. So that's the Boone Slough, Newt Slough complex and a number of other areas where it was a little bit more brackish. Then the green areas, dark green was forested tidal swamp back then, and light green was shrub tidal swamp. Now here's what it looks like today. The red areas are diked off and do not have tidal exchange, so they're no longer tidal wetlands. The remaining tidal wetlands, of which we have some pretty extensive ones here in Pool Slough, etc., it's almost all tidal marsh today. And here's the numbers on that. We've had a 78% loss of tidal marsh in the Yaquina, 92% loss of forested tidal swamp, and a 95% loss of shrub tidal swamp. So those are pretty big losses, but it's not unique to the Yaquina. Over the whole Oregon coast, tidal swamp, the forested and shrub swamps together made up about 58% of our tidal wetlands historically. So they were the majority of tidal wetlands. Tidal marsh was the minority of our tidal wetlands. Now today, we've lost 95% of that tidal swamp. Very little remains. And I'll get back to what that means to us and what actions we can take. So I just want to show you a few pictures because these are beautiful environments. What did our tidal marsh and swamp look like in the Yaquina before these changes? And what Pool Slough looks like now is a lot of what other areas probably looked like back then, including the Boone Slough, Newt Slough complex. This picture by Dave, again, is a great illustration. And this is what some tidal swamp looks like today, some small remaining areas of tidal swamp upstream of Toledo. This is a Sitka spruce swamp. And some pictures of the interior of that swamp showing how much large wood is present in these channels. It's quite amazing. This happens to be from the Nehalem, but this is what those areas up on Depot Slough and Olalla Slough probably looked like originally before they were diked off. This is from the Siuslaw. Back to the Nehalem, that's a low beaver dam here. And a couple pictures of shrub swamp. This is up above Toledo, upstream of Toledo. And one from the Siuslaw that's a little saltier. So what happened to all the tidal swamps? Always a question that the curious wish to answer. And this bovine is correct. Dikes and tide gates are the primary thing that happened to tidal swamps. This happens to be an area that was historically tidal marsh, again, the Boone Slough, Newt Slough complex, but it's one of the biggest diked areas in the Yaquina, which is why I'm using it here as an illustration. Tide gates are usually present at the mouths of these dike systems where water needs to drain out, and they keep the tides from coming in. And by the way, on the right, you'll see a type of tide gate that's widely used now called a muted tide regulator that provides a little bit of additional fish access, but doesn't restore processes that we know are going to be critical to tidal marsh resilience in the future and tidal swamp resilience. So there are downsides as well as upsides. So the other human activity besides diking and tide gating and conversion to agriculture, the other activity that contributed strongly to the loss of tidal swamps was logging of those spruce trees. And actually during World War II, there was an entire Army division devoted to logging spruce in the Northwest, the Spruce Production Division. And that's because they needed these spruce to build airplanes. Spruce was a really good material for airplane construction, light and resilient. And spruce growing near rivers, like in tidal swamps and on slopes nearby, were easier to transport because they could be dropped into the river and floated down to the mill. And as a happy coincidence, that cleared land was also needed for agriculture. And so there were a number of activities that were supported by the logging of spruce. So these are huge changes to the estuary, and I want to talk a little about why we care about these changes and how they affect the conditions and functions of wetlands that we see today. In other words, what were the impacts of these losses of tidal wetlands? So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the list of wonderful ecosystem services that are provided to us and to wildlife by tidal wetlands. And I won't go through this in detail. If you want more information about these functions, I really recommend checking out Paul Adamus's 2006 report, where he goes into the science background on how these functions are carried out in tidal wetlands and what affects their levels. He didn't cover carbon sequestration. That's a relatively new function that we've been studying only recently. So I bring this up partly because you can imagine that if we lost 70 or 80 or 90% of tidal wetlands, we also lost 70 or 80 or 90% of these functions. So that's a pretty big deal. So because there's been disproportionate loss of these tidal forests, along our coast and in the Yaquina, I want to go a little into more detail on the functions that were provided by these tidal swamps. And these are very active areas of study right now. We don't have a lot of data yet, so this is really breaking news that I'm presenting here from just the last couple of years. Oh, and I will be talking about salmon habitat and carbon sequestration. So in terms of salmon habitat in tidal swamps, the channels are pretty amazing. You saw the earlier picture with the large woody debris. The channels are deep, they're complex, they're often actually underground for some of their length. They're incredibly sinuous and dense. The channel networks are highly branched. It's an amazing thing to see a channel network in these tidal swamps. And within these channels is that large woody debris which holds water back at low tide, so the channels don't empty and the fish have a place to hang out at low tide, what we call a low tide refugia. They don't have to go back into the river, which is a really helpful thing for a young salmon that's not ready to be washed downstream into saltier water or perhaps even into the ocean during a storm. And beaver activity is very high in tidal swamps as well, so that makes even more refuge and feeding grounds for these young salmon, proven by others to be very productive. And because tidal swamps occur in the lower salinity portions of the estuary, sort of the freshwater tidal into the mid-mesohaline, there's a lot of salt adjustment opportunities for young salmon. They can move volitionally back and forth between different salinities and choose the area that works best for them as they start to adjust to salt and move towards the ocean. And finally, the multi-layered vegetation in tidal swamps with tall trees, many layers of branches, and then shorter trees and shrubs, and then the herbaceous layer, and then the channels themselves, means there are many opportunities for different kinds of insects to survive and to become salmon prey. And insects happen to be high energy prey, and I'll touch on that in a minute. So I want to quote Greg Hood and his colleagues who presented at the Salish Sea Ecosystem Conference a few years ago, and they said, just as a reminder, salmon habitat isn't just tidal channels, it's also tidal marsh, and the fish do forage out on the marsh surface. And just to amend that slightly, the fish also forage on the wetland surface in tidal swamp when the water is high. And so they have many foraging opportunities in tidal wetlands besides just channels. It's a good thing to remember. And getting into this question of high energy prey production, here's some interesting work by Isa Wu and her colleagues up in the Nisqually River estuary in Puget Sound. And their title is wordy, but it says a lot. A mosaic of different estuary habitat types like mudflats and marsh and tidal forests and riverine areas. Mosaic of those different habitat types with prey resources like insects and amphipods from multiple environmental strata, trees, shrubs, herbaceous. That wide range of habitat types and wide range of prey resources in turn supports a wide range of fish foraging opportunities. And so young Chinook salmon can benefit from that. And here's a fun graph that shows some of how this happens. So this is a non-metric multidimensional scaling graph in which data points cluster according to how similar they are. And these axes don't really mean anything except the proximity of points to each other is important. And these points actually represent individual fish. They captured 150 young Chinook salmon and they analyzed their gut contents. So each dot represents either one or more young salmon and what they were eating. And then each type of prey, be it insects or mysids, which are type of kind of like tiny shrimp, or dipterans, which are like little flies, each type of prey also is located in a certain space within this illustration or this graph. So for example, a fish that is shown by a dot over here was eating a lot of mysids, and a fish represented by a dot over here was eating a lot of insects. And then we can also bring in information on which habitat types were being sampled here. And I've got circles or ovals surrounding the centroid or the location where this habitat type occurred within the graph. It's a little hard to explain this, but I'll just try and point out that fish that were captured in eelgrass and fish that were captured in mudflat tended to eat a lot of amphipods, decapods, and mysids. Now, fish that were captured in forests really ate a very different diet. They ate mostly insects. And fish that were captured in marsh ate somewhere in between. They ate some of each. So that's a very interesting finding. And it was supported also by Melanie Davis's work and her crew in 2018. And they found that tidal forests provide higher quality food and higher modeled growth potential for young salmon compared to other estuary habitats like tidal marsh. So important work that really helps us understand why a diversity of habitats is important to fish and how these diverse habitats support life history diversity among salmon. And Corey Green, I think, Corey and his team expressed this really nicely in 2021. Habitat diversity is important for maximizing juvenile salmon growth opportunity, and I should add life history diversity. Restoration planning should focus on habitat diversity as well as capacity to support salmon population recovery and resilience. So that's why we've been emphasizing habitat type diversity. And I'll go into that a little more in a minute. But first I want to touch on another function of carbon sequestration. How does it compare among these different habitat types that we've been talking about? And what is it? What is blue carbon? Blue carbon is what we call carbon that's stored in tidal marshes or nearshore environments or tidal forests, anything that's a coastal habitat. And generally, we see a lot of carbon storage in soils in these environments because those soils are wet and they stay wet. And so the carbon doesn't oxidize and escape to the atmosphere. Carbon is taken up from the atmosphere by plants. It goes into the plant tissues and then it's stored in the soil. Some of it's stored in the plant tissues themselves too. And there are emissions. Carbon dioxide is released from tidal wetlands as well, and methane can be released, and it's a powerful greenhouse gas. So we're studying that too. But first, I want to show you some of the data we do have. How does carbon storage compare in tidal marsh like this and tidal swamp like this? You can imagine they could be pretty different, and they are really different. This is results from a study by Boone Kaufman and the rest of our team from the Blue Carbon Working Group. And this graph shows the averages for carbon stored in our Pacific Northwest tidal marsh and swamp habitats compared to other global averages. So on the left, megagrams of carbon stored per hectare in the soil, that's orange, and in plants, that's green, above ground. Here's our Pacific Northwest tidal forested wetlands. This is averaged across, I think, 6 sites. There were 37 sites, I think, total in this study. Really high levels of carbon storage, higher than any other environment or habitat type that's in the estuary globally. Strikingly high. Mangroves had previously been considered the champions of carbon sequestration, but it looks like our tidal forests are higher. Among tidal marsh, the Pacific Northwest tidal marsh also shows quite a bit higher carbon storage compared to other averages. Now, it's never fair to compare an average to a single type, but this is a good illustration nonetheless of the levels of carbon stored. Compared to upland habitats, now we're looking now at upland forests. The average for Oregon, around maybe 230 megagrams per hectare, compare that to the tidal forested wetlands, averaging somewhere above 1,000 megagrams of carbon per hectare. That's a big difference, and the only habitat type that compares to our tidal forest is old growth, Oregon coastal old growth. So this was breaking news a couple of years ago and is very important information that's guiding a lot of our activities now. What about climate change and sea level rise? What's coming up in the future? So as many of you know, the Mid-Coast Watersheds Council sponsored this really cool project a few years ago to analyze the potential impacts of sea level rise on Oregon's tidal wetlands and to plan for the future. And the Mid-Coast website that I've shown here has a lot of good information about the project, and then you can also download the report from the permanent link at the bottom here. And this project was funded by the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board and the Fish and Wildlife Services Coastal Program. And my organization, the Estuary Technical Group, did the GIS analysis and interpretation, and then Fran Richt managed this project for the Mid-Coast, and we jointly conducted a lot of outreach. And probably a bunch of you heard talks we gave back then. We carried the results out to stakeholders coastwide. Now, what we were looking at is where water currently is on the landscape and where it might be in the future, because tidal wetlands exist only in a narrow elevation range where water rises and falls within the wetland. So this neat graphic is a cross section of an estuary, and Joshua Shackley did this. I'm grateful to him because it was a lot better than my pencil sketch that I had previously. And here's a tidal bay or river, Yaquina Bay, Yaquina River. As you move upslope, you get into these mudflat environments. Then we get into the areas I'm talking about, the tidal marsh and the tidal swamp, which exist approximately between mean tide level and annual high tide. And their locations are controlled not just by elevation and inundation, but also by salinity, but that's a little harder to illustrate in a cross section. And then in the future, as those tidal datums rise, as the tides rise, then the tidal wetlands may need to move upslope towards the land, and we call that the landward migration zone, or the LMZ for short. And one of the important things to note is that as tidal wetlands move landward, if they have to, if the slope increases, the land area available to them decreases. It would be quite small up here where the slope is steep. So that's a problem because it reduces the available area for tidal wetlands. And I can illustrate that with our different scenarios from this project. So I'm going to start now with 0 centimeters of sea level rise. And this shows the Yaquina Estuary, with the light blue being water and mudflat currently, and the dark blue being areas that are within tide range. So they could potentially be tidal wetlands. That's within that mean tide level to annual high tide. Now with 23 centimeters of sea level rise, there's a slight shrinkage of the area available for tidal wetlands. Some of it has moved upslope. Some of it can't. And some areas have converted to mudflat because they're now below mean tide level at this scenario. At 48 centimeters of sea level rise, 1.5 feet, we see a 10% loss of area available for tidal wetlands. At 75 centimeters, a 24% loss. Now we're having some upslope migration, but in the Yaquina, primarily the tributaries and the main stem narrow down pretty quickly, and we don't have a lot of upstream floodplains to work with. With 1.42 meters of sea level rise, things are not looking terrific because we only have a 46% loss, which of course is pretty huge, but many of the areas that are at the appropriate elevation are actually not appropriate for future tidal wetland, like these industrial sites in Toledo. They're at the right elevation under this sea level rise scenario, but they're not going to be great tidal wetlands in the future, most likely. We did analyze a couple higher scenarios just to see what happens. In 2.5 meters, we have a 66% loss. And the highest scenario we looked at was a 3.5 meter rise. And in this case, 77% loss. And the only remaining tidal wetland areas are way upstream in Depot Slough and way upstream on the main stem. And they're pretty narrow, so pretty different type of environment as well. So those are kind of bleak maps. But there are some positives here. Sediment accretion is another huge factor in what happens to tidal wetlands under climate change scenarios. So the fine sediment you see along the banks of this channel, that fine sediment is deposited on every high tide cycle. And when the tide spreads out across the surface of the wetland, fine sediment is deposited there too. If you've ever left any of your equipment out in the tidal marsh, you know how you come back later and it's covered with mud. So that's the process of accretion, and that's the fundamental process that creates tidal wetlands. They form in response to sea level, and they are maintained in equilibrium with sea level within limits. They're maintained by the availability of sediment to adjust to rising seas. If sediment accretion is adequate and sea level isn't too rapid, then tidal wetlands might actually be able to persist in place and not have to move upslope. So will that happen? We actually don't know yet. We don't have a consensus on that. Karen Thorne's group came out with a 2018 report, in which she saw a pretty dire result. They modeled specific sites throughout the Northwest, not including anywhere in the Yaquina, but looking at some other places in Oregon. Her conclusion was that with 1.42 meters of sea level rise, we would lose 83% of our Pacific Northwest tidal marshes. She did not look at tidal swamp, and also she didn't look at landward migration. So this is not as complete a study, except that it's geographically very broad. In our 2017 report, we found that with that same sea level rise scenario, 46% of Yaquina tidal wetlands would convert to mudflat. And I should point out that Karen Thorne's group incorporated sediment accretion into their model, and nonetheless saw these dire results, but again, didn't look at landward migration. And we did not incorporate sediment accretion in our model, but when we looked at the same exact sites that Karen Thorne's group studied, we found very similar results. So this is all interesting, and you can learn more if you want to look at the reports that are linked here. Now, most recently, I was part of a team, and Erin Peck produced our Journal of Geophysical Research article in 2020 showing that sediment accretion is actually keeping pace with past sea level rise in most Oregon estuaries. And that doesn't sound terribly impressive when you think about what future sea level rise might look at, but on the other hand, sediment supply is very high in our Oregon estuaries, and our estuaries are currently only capturing about 5% or 10% of the total available sediment. The rest is rolling out to sea. So there's a good opportunity for more sediment to be captured and to contribute towards potential persistence of tidal wetlands in situ. Oh, and by the way, I wanted to mention that Erin Peck's project used deep cores and looked at long-term accretion, and the work was done using radioisotopes, stable isotopes. And Karen Thorne's group also used that technology. So I've talked about a bunch of the different forces that shape the estuary and its tidal wetlands and the impacts that humans have had on the landscape, including climate change. And I'd like to end on a hopeful note by talking about some of the actions we can take to keep our tidal wetlands and estuaries healthy. First, we can conserve and restore tidal wetlands. You all know that. We also, of course, need to look to the future and think about the land's upslope, because we don't know yet whether tidal wetlands can persist in place, and it seems fairly likely that some of them at least are going to need to move. So think in 3 dimensions now, even 4, looking at the time scale. In taking these actions, we need to use previous studies and prioritizations to guide where we act and what the priorities should be. And then there's a lot of research that still needs to happen to answer a bunch of burning questions that we have right now. And we're working on those. And in terms of prioritizations that have been used, this is the most recent. It was from our 2017 sea level rise study, which contained not just those maps of where wetlands might be, but also a prioritization for one scenario, the 1.42 meter sea level rise scenario, looking at these factors: the size of available landward migration zones, land ownership, zoning, and development status. And the priorities illustrated in this map, these are wetlands that would occur at that pretty high sea level rise scenario. The blue ones are higher priority based on those factors, and the red areas are low priority. And the black actually indicates impervious surfaces. So these industrial sites are not a good priority for future protection or conservation or restoration activities. And based on those types of studies and prioritizations, of which there have been several in the Yaquina, there have been quite a few tidal wetland restoration projects in recent years. And the Mid-Coast Watersheds Council has been particularly active in this area, developing projects that grew out of those prioritization studies. And here are some examples. And I won't go into all of these, but you can see there's been a couple on the Olalla Slough. There's some work in Pool Slough, basically enhancing some areas. And then we have these projects upstream here, which are circled on the Yaquina Estuary Conservation Plan Atlas map from the Wetlands Conservancy. And I want to focus in on this project upstream of Toledo, a couple miles. It's called Site Y27, not a pretty exciting name, but we had a lot of sites in our study back in 1999, and that's the name that it got. And it was originally restored in 2002. So here you can see the excavator digging the breach in the dike to allow the tides into the site. This photo is from 2002. Now in phase 2 in 2020, the new project really builds on our recent research results. It restores Sitka spruce tidal swamp, which we didn't restore in the earlier project. It emphasizes sediment connectivity to allow sediment accretion to give this site a chance to keep pace with sea level rise. And it also is climate change aware and helps build resilience to climate change and sea level rise. I have to also mention that the equipment was really superior in 2020. So some pretty amazing low ground pressure equipment that the Midcoast used with their contractors to do this work. And the work included large woody debris placement and enhancement of channel stability around the city of Toledo's water line, which I gather received the mark of approval from the local heron population. And in this recent project, channels were also excavated to target widths and depths. It was a more engineered project. This kind of work hadn't been possible back in 2002. We had a much more limited budget back then. So it's a pretty neat project. And it really is one of the examples of restoration actions that are prioritizing the most impacted habitat types and which are focused on improving climate change and sea level rise resilience. So these are the ways that we're thinking about restoration actions now. We need to focus on habitat types that are disproportionately lost. We need to think of the future, consider sediment and salinity as we plan these projects. What project locations might have the best opportunity to maintain their elevations through accretion and to persist in place against sea level rise, and which project sites might have the best opportunity for landward migration if necessary. And I want to put in a plug for hydrodynamic modeling because this is a way that we can get at sediment movement and salinity regimes and dynamics across the estuary into the future with the appropriate inputs. And we need to also allow beaver and other non-human system engineers to help us. Beaver are very helpful at elevating surfaces, trapping sediment, encouraging woody growth. And there are other system engineers too, which I'll mention in a moment. So with 95% loss of historical tidal swamps on the Oregon coast, we really do want to restore this habitat type. And the basics for tidal swamp restoration are take dikes down and restore flows, restore channels, etc. But there are some unique, important considerations for swamp restoration. And one is choosing a site and planting trees and shrubs at the appropriate elevation and salinity regimes for these species like Sitka spruce. And here's the crew from the Midcoast Watersheds Council and volunteers and other affiliated people planting trees back in 2003 at that Y27 site. And the spruce were planted on the dike back then. We breached the dike. And this is some of those trees that were planted in 2003, and they're doing great in 2020. They grew beautifully. So clearly that was a suitable elevation and salinity zone. It was actually up on the dike, slightly above the wetland. And many of these big trees were preserved in the recent project. And then I want to show you a few slides from a site on the North Fork Siuslaw. This is a tidal swamp restoration project, mitigation actually for the North Fork Bridge. And this pasture area, 100% reed canary grass at the time we began the project. That photo's from 2006, and I'm using Google Maps or Google Earth here to show a sequence of aerials. This is 2012, and you can see the little dots that are the spruce that we planted. Jeff Jones did the planting, by the way. He's good at these tidal swamp projects. This is 2016, and you can see those dots have grown quite a bit. Those are the spruce. They were very happy at this site. And then 2019, and the canopy is almost closed now. So 12 years later, we have very good results with the Sitka spruce plantings here. And the reed canary grass is much, much diminished. It's nearly gone across much of this site. So a real success with tidal swamp restoration here. Of course, it doesn't look like a mature tidal swamp, but it'll get there. So one of the challenges with tidal swamp restoration is you can't restore it where it used to be necessarily, because a lot of these sites, like this one, which is a former tidal swamp, they're so subsided. The land surface has really dropped because of drainage of the soil and compaction and the drying out of the surface soils, which allows the carbon, the very high carbon contents, to oxidize and leave the site. It basically results in a low ground surface. So often the former diked sites are not the best places if they're very low, and they're not going to support tidal swamp. But we can often find other places in the landscape nearby that are at the right elevation and have the right salinity regimes to support Sitka spruce swamp. And over time, some of these subsided areas may accumulate enough sediment to support trees. So we do have some challenges with invasives. Reed canary grass is a problem in some of these areas. And there are a bunch of groups working on methods that can help deal with reed canary grass. You can build log cribs like Jake Robinson has done at this Coquille site. Those elevate the spruce saplings up above the reed canary grass, give them better rooting environment that's not so wet, and help them escape the competition. And we don't have a lot of results yet from that work, but it looks like it may be working. They did grow. And here, Matt Ruwald from the Umpqua Partnership is showing some work he's done with chainsaws and big logs, making slots in the logs for young spruce to grow, be elevated, but also get their roots down to the soil. And other groups have suggested things like constructed soil mounds for planting woody species on, like spruce or shrubs. And this can be a good approach if it's really carefully planned. It does involve placing fill in wetlands, and it has to be approached with a lot of caution because of that. But it can, if it's done right and carefully planned, it could mimic the kind of topographic variation that's present on the floor of a tidal swamp. Now, all these methods may also help with sea level rise adaptation, because we can elevate plantings and help them persist even with greater inundation. And some of the characteristics of these plants and other creatures that live in the tidal swamps will help us too. Beaver activity, as I mentioned before. And then the fact that Sitka spruce trees have these huge root platforms that elevate their roots up above the wet soil, that gives the tree a chance to survive. Its fine roots are in drier soil, and it also gives a lot of other plants and organisms a chance to survive. So we have a bunch of tools available to us. And so, since I'm coming to the end of my talk now, I want to just mention some of the studies that helped build this talk and develop the data that I've presented. And you can click on these links in the PDF, which will be up on the Hatfield seminar series website if you want to go check out these reports, and I encourage it. And then join us and support the research that's being done to gather the data and answer the burning questions that we still have on blue carbon and greenhouse gas exchange, sediment transport, sea level rise resilience, the potential for co-seismic subsidence, where it may be the worst, where it may be less severe. One of the groups that's really actively working on this is the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group, which I'm a part of and helped found. Actually, it was about 10 years ago that we started that group. And I encourage you to check out their website. So I guess I've gotten through all my topics successfully. And I think that we now actually have time for questions and discussion, which I'm really looking forward to. So I think I will stop sharing at this point so that we can all see each other better.
Thank you, Laura, and one great presentation, really comprehensive, lots of information around this. And so I want to invite everyone who's online to either post a question in the chat, or you're also welcome to turn on your video and mic and ask your question verbally. So we'll see if we have questions from the audience online. Okay, lots of comments and great presentation, great talk. I had a question for you right off the bat. Could you talk a little bit more about the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon project that you stated right at the end there?
Sure, it's a pretty big group. There's folks from many different universities and research organizations, nonprofits, and councils and so forth, independent scientists. And the goal of the group is just to learn more about blue carbon functions in our tidal wetlands and gather the data needed to fill data gaps. And it happens that the entire Pacific Northwest was a giant data gap when we started. There was lots of data on blue carbon from elsewhere in the country, primarily the East Coast, but very little from the Northwest. So we've been sort of scrambling to try to fill that big data gap. And that project by Boone Kaufman, where he was the lead author, it was a big team. And that was called our Carbon Stocks Project. And we just looked at carbon content of soils, which is sort of the first step, soils and plant parts above ground. And that Carbon Stocks Project, I think, has gathered quite a bit of attention. But we're now working on greenhouse gas exchange measurements in these different habitat types. And I'm hoping we'll get to the shrub swamps as well. We did we did forest and tidal swamps and marsh, high and low marsh, but we didn't do shrub swamps yet. And I think they're very interesting.
Well, thank you. Questions from the audience?
I see a hand raised, Cheyenne.
Hi, Laura. Yeah, this was an amazing talk. It was great to see those progress photos and everything. I was wondering if you could speak to whether or not these areas that are like these diked areas that were maybe more like carbon released and kind of a bit more degraded, if there's still any hope or chance for restoration work around them, or what that would entail.
Very much so. One of the neat things with restoration is a lot of these restored sites, if they're, most of them are at an elevation where they receive a lot of tidal inundation and therefore they receive a lot of sediment. And most of them aren't so low that they would just be mudflat. If we really get on this now and we start restoring them now, these can trap a huge amount of sediment. And that means they also store a huge amount of carbon, because the carbon that's produced by the plants is buried by sediment. And so you kind of need both. You need the plants gathering the carbon and the carbon going into the soil, and then more sediment burying that carbon and immobilizing it in the wet soil. So yes, there's great opportunities. There's a report out there by Steve Crooks and a group working in the Snohomish, and the rates of carbon sequestration are very high in some of these restoration sites.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
We have a question in the chat from Ted. Most of your examples of tidal wetland restoration were focused in brackish reaches of estuaries. Are there restoration efforts in the lower, more saline reaches, and are those areas of lower priority?
I think the priorities have been looking at historical loss, and the loss of low marsh is generally not as bad as the loss of high marsh, because low marsh usually wasn't diked off because it was too wet and too low and too salty to make good pasture. So there have been less restoration efforts in those areas. Now, it doesn't mean it's not of interest. In particular for blue carbon, for carbon sequestration, saltier areas are of interest because they're less likely to release methane. But we have to balance that with the fact that they are low in the landscape, at least those that are at a low elevation. They have potentially less resilience to sea level rise because of that. They're starting with low elevation capital, as they call it. So yes, there's interest, but it has not been a primary target for restoration. Low marsh and very salty marsh has not generally been a target for restoration. It's usually less disturbed than other habitat types.
We have another question from Michael Banks, and I'm really interested in this question as well. He says, thank you for all that you taught us. How do tidal spruce swamps compare with upland spruce swamps in terms of carbon capture? And is the loss of upland spruce swamps perhaps even higher?
I think I'm guessing perhaps you were referring to non-tidal spruce swamps. So there are non-tidal spruce swamps for sure. They are rare. They're very rare. Probably on a par with the tidal spruce swamps. My guess is they captured a lot of carbon as well. They may have emitted a fair bit of methane, but tidal spruce swamps may emit methane too. We don't know yet. We're just starting to measure that. And often the above ground storage of carbon in these big trees can compensate for any methane release. That's part of why they're a big target for restoration right now for carbon functions. So both are important. I have not worked as much in the area of non-tidal spruce swamp restoration, but it would be great. We definitely could use it. If we're referring to upland spruce forests, that's a different matter. They would have a different carbon scenario because they would have less soil storage potentially because the soils aren't as wet, but they would have above ground storage just as other upland forests do. So a couple different answers based on different spruce environments.
We have another question from Philip at Oregon Shores. Has there been a study that relates areas for potential landward migration in terms of elevation to existing development that would block upslope migration?
I haven't seen that quantified or analyzed comprehensively. I think that is an area that's probably ripe for investigation, looking at barriers like roads and so forth. Similar to barriers to animal movement, there are barriers to movement of these tidal wetlands. We have a bunch of work going on right now to try to comprehensively and accurately map these barriers, be they roads or tide gate dike systems or railroads or filled urban or residential areas. So, but we have not looked so much at the connectivity, the landscape connectivity to potential future tidal wetlands. So that would be a neat area to look into.
Another question in the chat from David Thompson, or better yet, tidal bald cypress swamps, which store less than inland bald cypress swamps, according to one publication. Anyways, how do tidal spruce swamps compare to tidal bald cypress swamps?
Oh, I wish I could answer that. I do not know. I'm working on a project that covers some of these bald cypress areas down in the southeast, but I have not read up on their carbon storage functions yet. So I cannot answer that, but they're really interesting habitats. And I don't know much about whether swamps or whether the tidal ones or the non-tidal ones would store more carbon. That's always an interesting question.
Yeah. Any more questions from the audience? We have another one here in the chat from Jerry Anderson. What is the highest priority for further research?
What a good question. I think I would like to see better modeling on sediment and salinity regimes of the future and where we might find the hottest areas, I shouldn't say hot with climate change, where we might find the most likely areas to restore that would have the best chance of maintaining resilience over the long term, even with sea level rise. It would be sort of a hotspot analysis looking at availability of landward migration zones, sediment delivery to that location based on its landscape setting and the sediment supply within the estuary. And factors like freshwater flow sources, be they mountain snows and how that might change in the future. So, I guess I'm saying the research priority is everything, but it would be nice to put these pieces together and to come up with some guidance for groups on where to focus their efforts that's a little more comprehensive than what we can do right now.
I suspect it might be on a case-by-case basis to look as far as location. We have a question from Ted. Has anyone anticipated how climate change might affect tidal wetland plant community composition and consequently how that might affect restoration planning or tidal wetland functions?
Yeah, there's been some study of that, basically prompted by some problems they had up in the Stillaguamish. It was some of the slides that I couldn't present today. Roger Fuller did a nice presentation about a big dieback they had at a tidal marsh in the Stillaguamish in 2015. And it has no problem with salt. The bulrush that was growing there is fine. It doesn't mind salt at all. But 2015 was a dry year. River flows were low, temperatures were high. Salt stress on the plants was quite a bit higher than normal. And either in response to that stress or as a part of the whole ball of wax that is climate, there were some insects that came in and may have really affected the plant health as well. So we have a combination of stresses. So climate change isn't just sea level rise, it's also plant stress, herbivory, salinity increase, and that kind of thing. So yeah, there have been some studies. 2015, Roger was saying, if 2015 is an example of what future years might look like, then we've got some challenges ahead of us. And I would say this affects restoration planning in that we may want to prioritize sites that have freshwater input, for instance, over sites that have none, because they may have more opportunity to survive some of these increasing salinity events. And how it might affect tidal wetland function. Similarly, I'd say that's ripe for investigation. There's been more study of sea level rise, but not yet of other climate change factors.
Wow, thanks for that answer. Paul Engelmeyer has a question in the chat. Are there many reference sites that did have log drives or conversion to agricultural lands at the basin scale decades ago?
Yeah, many coastal watersheds had log drives and conversion to ag lands. So I don't know exactly what you're asking, Paul. There are reference sites within those watersheds and estuaries, but they're all altered. Everything's altered on our coast. So even a reference site that we consider at least disturbed is somewhat altered. So I'm not sure I'm really answering your question. The Coquille is an interesting example of an estuary that had a lot of impacts from logging and splash damming, and the head of tide changed radically, moved way downstream, many, many miles, and has a 98% conversion of former tidal wetlands into agricultural land. So that's an example of a site that had a lot of that. Now, you may have been asking, are there any reference sites that didn't have log drives or conversion to ag lands at the basin scale? I would say few, very few. It's an interesting thing to think about. We might be able to locate some where the impacts were less. They might be in really smaller estuaries. I don't know of any completely pristine reference sites that have never been affected by such basin activities, basin scale activities.
That
Sounds
was
like a
my
challenge. Sorry, go ahead.
That was my question. Did not have log drives and splash dams.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's tough to find a site. It's tough to find an estuary that didn't have impacts from those activities. They were pretty pervasive. Log drives maybe less so in some areas, but I honestly don't know exactly which river systems were the most impacted by log drives and which weren't. Good question.
All right. Well, I don't think we have any further questions. Laura, thank you again for your presentation. I think we all really appreciate your time. If you wouldn't mind putting your contact information in the chat so that folks can contact you, that would be great. And just to remind everyone that we will be posting the recording of this as well as the PDF on our website, on the HMSC website. So look for that probably sometime early next week.
Thank you, Chung. It was a pleasure to be part of this series.
Great to have you. Thank you. And thank you, Ted.
Great.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Have a great weekend, everyone.